The faith is a lot broader than a lot of times we came up to with it.
Right. Hi, welcome back to Fractured Faith, a mosaic of beliefs. I'm one of your hosts, Angel Ford.
This is Joshua Hopping.
And today we are going to unpack what is Christianity.
Christianity? Isn't that like a very basic terminology?
Yeah, it is.
So this is like a 2-minute episode?
Yeah. Okay, that was it. Thank you so much for joining in. We'll see y'all in 2 weeks. Bye.
We're done right there. This is how we roll. 30 seconds in, and we've already answered the question.
Wow, good job. I feel like we covered so much ground that so many theologians just couldn't do in their decades of study.
All right, so when you talk about defining Christianity, what are you talking about, Angel?
Yeah. So Christianity, when different people hear it, they think different things. Big umbrella terms, right? Like when we say Christianity, we have like a lot of different subgroups, right? We have like Catholics or Protestant churches or LDS or even white Christian nationalism. We have even groups like in the KKK, right? Or Republican. I know.
Democrats too.
I don't know. Can you?
Can you?
We'll talk about that. So yeah, I think I was in high school when I realized that Christianity didn't mean the same thing to other people as it meant to me. And as I got older, especially going into like the mental health field, and especially post 2016, I don't remember why that year was very significant.
I don't know either.
But I remember there were times in the counseling space not wanting my clients to know that I was a Christian, just because I knew that word gave a message that wasn't what I was trying to give. So yeah, I think it's important for us to kind of unpack like where we land with what Christianity means. And that way, even as our audience, you know what we're talking about when we say Christian.
Yeah. Again, defining of terms to be able to see it. Because I've experienced the same thing in the tech field. So my day job has been in anti-counterfeiting and tech startups and anti-fraud work. So I've worked with a lot of people from different religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, and to say the word Christian can bring up all this, a lot of times, animosity. If you look about other countries around the globe, a lot of times these nations have national religions. United States, one of the unique things about the United States is the freedom of religion. It is the Bill of Rights declaring that the state should make no laws declaring what religion. Now, whether or not that's been upheld or not, debatable. But the essence of what they were trying to accomplish, I thought was actually pretty good on that sense. So we have a lot of different religions and a lot of diversity within our borders. If you go to places like Saudi Arabia, it's all Muslim. They actually say 100% Muslim. And even if you don't follow or practice Islam, you're still a Muslim. Or if you go to places over in kind of Southeastern Asia, not so much India, but some of the other ones, you get a lot of places, well, you're Buddhist or you're Hindu or you're whatever that religion is for that nation, and that's it. And if you may not practice that, but that's the national religion. And so a lot of people look at America, because America is, and there's a lot of people in America who claim that America is a Christian nation. Right. And they say, well, everybody in America is a Christian. And so it doesn't matter what's happening. So like you said, you hinted at, you're white supremacists, you're KKK, you're Democrats, you're Republicans, you're whatever, just name your Hollywood, all the way to your Amish. So I mean, it goes from both extremes. Everybody's a Christian because you're a United States American. Right. And that's not really, well, when I use the word Christian, that's, well, not really what I'm referring to. So going back to you, Angel, how would you define Christian? Like, what does that word mean to you?
Yeah. So for myself, and a lot of my theology is biblical theology. And so when I try to define anything within the Christian context, I go back into what does the Bible say about this?
Which Bible?
Thank you.
There's like 14 different biblical canons.
Right.
Which one?
The one that's on my phone, the Holy Bible, the little the Holy Bible app. That one.
The one on the app. Okay.
Right. Oh, well, that's another episode. But yes, the standard one we get. What is it? The Gideon Bible when you go into the hotels. Yes, exactly. That one. Okay. That one. If you go to a hotel and you open up the drawer and you pick it up, that's the one I'm talking about.
That one, King James, 1611 King James version.
Let's see. I think right now I have the NLT on here and the NIV. Ooh, that's another episode. It's like, why all these different versions? Yes. But anyways, so yeah, I go to that book when trying to define anything. And so for me, when I say Christian, I'm looking in the book of Acts, following the way. Are we disciples of Jesus, following his teachings, applying his teachings, teaching others these teachings? Are we ascribing to the Great Commission, essentially? And is that, if it falls within that, that's what I'm talking about when I talk about Christianity.
Well, that's really broad, though.
It is. It is and it isn't. Because I would say you have some of these subgroups, and you're going to be a lot more braver in calling out groups. So I'll let you do that, where they would say that because I don't do certain things that they're pushing towards, that I'm not a Christian. And because I have biblical theology, I wouldn't say that they aren't a Christian, because I don't think that's my place. But I would press them to maybe rethink the way that they're behaving in order to follow the way.
Yeah. So again, there's so much to unpack in this one here. We get like why we have an episode about it. So kind of going back to the word Christian, which the English word comes from the Greek word, which I cannot pronounce it. I am not a Greek scholar, but I do know that it's means little Christ. And that's really where the impact came into, which Christ being is a title. It's not a name.
Right.
Jesus' last name isn't Christ. Right. It's Jesus of Nazareth, so Jesus bar Joseph, the son of Joseph, which is, again, English versions of Aramaic, Hebrew kind of terminology. But Christ was connected to Messiah, which, again, it's this anointed one, somebody who's actually coming. So Jesus of Nazareth came up, and he was pronouncing a liberation and salvation and healing to the people. And they said, hey, you're going to be the Christ or the Messiah, to which would have been prophesied that this is going to happen. So we get the word Christ. So then Christian, little Christ, are those who are following or being like Christ, okay, like Jesus. In the scriptures, going back to Acts, because that kind of, again, we look at a typical Bible that we have, a Protestant kind of Bible.
The typical Bible. You don't have a fancy name for it, just the typical.
It's a typical, right? There's like, again, another episode, there's like 14 canons. It's a different story. But your typical, if you go to the book of Acts and look at it, you see that it has their followers of the way. That's what they were being called. This would have been in Acts chapter 11. And that's where Jesus of Nazareth was calling the people to follow a different way of life that's different than those around them.
Right.
Which was really radical because, hey, we have Jewish people and we have Gentile people. And we have lots of different people within there because Judaism isn't, and Gentiles are not, I think what the word is, there's a lot of diversity within those groups. Right. We tend to think of them sometimes being very singular, but they're not. They're very, very broad in a lot of places. But so they're followers of the way. They're disciples. To be a disciple is to mean that you're following a person. Right. So Christianity, at its core sense, is a follower of Christ, aka a follower of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, a student of his teachings.
Now, I hate that word.
Yes, you do. I am very indifferent towards the word, but you have feelings about that word. I have feelings
about the word, and I wrestle with it because on one hand, I know what's being said.
Right.
I know Christianity is something that it puts it in that broader context, and there's sometimes I will use that word. At the same time, I actually don't like it. I hate it because there's so much baggage that is like tied into that. Like I mentioned before about the everybody in the U.S. is a Christian. So I grew up, the more background for me, I grew up in Oklahoma and Texas, and this is kind of the buckle the Bible belt kind of mentality, and where everybody was a believer, everybody was a Christian, everybody went to church. You can go out and get wasted on Friday and then show up to church Sunday morning, and what you did Sunday had no bearing on what you did Monday through Friday.
Or you could be a creaster. You could show up just a couple times a year.
Yeah.
And you're fine.
And, we could talk about church attendance and all that kind of stuff later. I know as a pastor, you have
Right.
you want people to show up. Like, hey.
Because we're not supposed to bemoan gathering with other
There you
believers.
Go. At the same time, though, having grown up in that mentality,
Right.
it was like, how do you know who's actually doing this, right? Because I think there's a difference between people who are saying that they're a follower of Jesus and those who actually do and actually move it, right?
Right.
And that's one thing for my journey is I've moved from thinking about what people say to what they do. And
Right.
talk is cheap. I mean, it is cheap. I'm like, all right, stop talking. And are you living this way?
Right.
Are you having what Paul would say in Galatians 5, the fruits of spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, self-control, gentleness, against those things. Are these bubbling things up? Are you actually going after the red letters of Jesus and actually doing them? Are you loving and blessing your enemies? And that's one thing I hear so much going on with Christianity, quote unquote, is that people say, well, we can't love our neighbor. We can't turn the other cheek because we have to defend ourselves.
Right.
And I'm like, wait a minute. The guy said, turn the cheek. The guy said to love your enemies and bless those who persecute you. Why aren't we doing that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of people who ascribe more into the less graceful pockets of Christianity. Again, I'll let you call out the subgroups. I think they adhere a lot more to like the old law covenant, where they kind of talk more of like the hellfire damnation and like this is God's holy law, and if you like live out in any way outside of that, then we really just don't care about you. Like we're gonna rain fire on you because it's holy.
Right. So I'm the bad person here on the podcast, right?
No, you're not the bad person.
I'm not the bad.
You're less shy than me.
You're less shy. There we go. So, I'm not going to I'm not going to call out specific church groups or whatnot,
Right.
but definitely grew up. I think both of us have done this, where there are groups that will say that to be a Christian, you have to be our follower of our group, right? So,
yeah.
There's a couple of church denominations that are really famous for this. Even the Roman Catholics are really big on you have to be a Roman Catholic in order to actually be able to follow Jesus. Now, Vatican II in the 60s, they kind of softened that a little bit more to where they say, you're not in full communion, but you're still kind of a believer. So they soften that view quite a bit to where they actually recognize that you can be a follower of Jesus and not be a Catholic. But
Right.
for a long time, those two things were synonymous to each other.
Right.
You have groups like the Missionary Baptists down in kind of the South that they're really famous again, that in order to be a church member, you need to be baptized by a pastor in the Missionary Baptist.
Right. They're more exclusive faiths.
Very exclusive groups, right? So you have some very fundamental kind of groups that are exclusives, and then you have some ones that are more broader and, open communion, for example. Anybody could take a communion. You
Right.
don't have to have a baptism paper in their church, or you don't have to have a declaration of faith for them, because I have actually been to churches where before you are able to take communion,
Right.
the pastor has to have a conversation with you,
Right.
and you have to, meet the different check marks before you can actually take communion.
Yeah.
Which gets very embarrassing if you're walking up to the communion.
Right. I didn't realize how exclusive certain faiths were until I went to a Catholic church for the first time, just to kind of like check it out to see what was going on. It was actually for a school assignment in my undergrad, and I never been to a mass before. And there was this older woman. She was so sweet. She was like, "Oh, why are you here?" And I told her and everything. And then it came time for communion, and I was like, "Oh, great! Like my church does communion." And she told me, like, if you're not Catholic, you can't go down and partake. And I was like, "What?"
Yes.
I've been partaking for like over a decade. What do you mean I can't partake?
Oh, you heretic.
I know, because I wasn't Catholic.
You weren't Catholic.
And so I kind of bring that up to also say, just because you may ascribe to a more exclusive faith doesn't mean that like that's necessarily quote unquote wrong, or you're not practicing the way. Because I don't want to say just like exclusive faiths are wrong or they don't have it correct. It's just a different way of viewing things.
Yeah, and I think for us on this podcast and some of the ways we're doing Fractured Faith and Mosaic of Beliefs is we really are trying to pull people back to say, hey, look, the faith is a lot broader than a lot of times we came up to with it.
Right.
Both of us shared a little bit of our stories at the first episode. Mm-hmm. And on that, we talked about how both of us kind of grew up in some more of the fundamental kind of groups of Christianity. Fundamentalists being very known historically for having a few key doctrines that are saying, hey, you have to believe these fundamentals about the faith in order to be Christians. And they draw a hard line around who's a believer, who's not a believer.
Right.
Different groups will draw that line either at a prayer, at a belief, at a baptism, or in church attendance, or whatever that line is, but there's a hard line on that one. Mm-hmm. And I think both of us have actually moved from that,
right,
and moved into other areas of where we come to realize that, wow, faith in Jesus, being little Christians, followers of the way, mm-hmm. is a lot more broader than what we originally were taught as a child, and that we can also look back and say, hey, these are some really amazing people who are doing the best that they could with the information they had on hand.
Right.
And my life would not be where it is now if it wasn't for them.
Right. Same.
Right. And so I really want to kind of hold that. And if some of the people I know were probably listening to the podcast probably knew me from those days. It's like, I love you. I care for you. You're awesome. I really do. But I also realize that the Spirit of God is taking me in a different direction,
right, and
really kind of holding that out in places.
Right. And
so that's that mosaic of belief. And so when we use the word Christianity or Christian, I want to make sure we're talking about that in the broadest term possible, or we're referring to Jesus of Nazareth as mm-hmm. Christian. So under that broad terminology, all these different groups we talked about before counts. Everything from what we consider quote unquote very liberal churches, your mainland churches, your Catholic, your Orthodox, your Oriental Orthodox, your Coptic churches, your Catholic churches, your Protestant churches, your pre-Protestant churches, like you got into Waldens and the Moravians and the Brethren Pills. There's a lot of different groups when you go around the world. And even in Africa, which had some of the earliest church gatherings were in Africa, because St. Mark went over there in about 70 or 69, 50 AD and was actually going around preaching there, where Paul was up in Europe and Turkey. John Mark went down into Alexandria. So, and then you have all these groups that come throughout into Africa and spread across. You come over into, the Americas, and there's all this different broad nations. Mm-hmm. And so I am one that I love diversity. And I think we got to keep that in mind in Christianity.
Right.
So that is, for those listening, that really is the broader pictures of what's coming in and what we're doing that.
Right. And I think it's great to highlight what we're including in that. And I think it's also important for our audience to understand who we're probably excluding when we talk about Christians.
Ooh.
Yeah, I know. Now
you're calling them out.
Now I'm calling them out. Well, and I won't call them out specifically, but if you pay attention to the news, you'll be able to read between the lines. I don't look at Christianity and ascribe it to a political stance. And I know there are some groups that have very specific political stance and will tag the name Christian onto them. And just because they're trying to adopt and intertwine that word into what they're trying to do politically doesn't mean that they are behaving within the definition of Christianity that we've talked about.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think also they brought in mind of a centered set. Have you heard about a centered set mentality?
A center set?
Center set.
Center set.
So
say that.
Center set.
Center set.
How's that 5 times, right?
Center set.
So there is a concept a couple decades ago was actually talking about this one. John Wimber, who goes on to found and lead the Vineyard Christian group, was really big on the center set, and it's actually been kind of going through a lot of different people caught onto it. But basically, the concept is, in the statistical analysis, you have a bound set A bound set is kind of what we talked about before when we grow up. So if you think about a target, like an archery target or a target, whatnot, you have the ring, the circle in the middle, and stuff like that. So a bound set would say, if you're on the target, you're great. So if you're hitting the target, you're good. It doesn't matter if you're in the center of the target, on the outside of the target, as long as you're just on the target. If you're there, right? Okay. That's really the bound set of places. Now define that on the edge in different ways. And he's like, or can you lose your faith, your salvation? Can you gain your salvation? Sure. Is it a prayer? Is it action? Is it baptism? So that edge becomes so important because it really defines who's in and who's out. Sure. Right? And that's where some of those groups get really, really caught up on. They read the scriptures, they're trying to find out because they want to know where the edge is. And that is important because then once I know who's in crowd, then I know who I can relax with. And if they're not in the in crowd, then I know who I need to have evangelism to be able to save. Right. So that's a bound set. A center set says there is a center that we're trying to get at. Right. Go back to the target analogy, is that the center of the circle would be Jesus of Nazareth. And it doesn't really matter if you're on the target or not on the places. You're trying to get as close to the center as possible. And so it's really going towards movement towards the center. So if you're starting with archery and you're shooting and you're right now, you miss the entire hay bale on the target completely, but then you keep practicing and you get closer and closer and closer, and then you're on to the target and then you get closer and closer to the center. That's great. You're in motion. And as long as you're moving in that direction, the thumbs up. This is great. You're moving towards Jesus. The Holy Spirit is drawing you towards them. If you're on a target and all of a sudden you're starting to shoot further away, you're moving away from it. You'd be maybe an inch from the target, but now you're starting to move away from it. That's negative. So in a practical sense is you can look like the most holy person, whatever that looks like in your head.
Right. Like, what does that even mean?
What is it? Yeah, exactly. Because clothes are subjective or not. But audience, use your own imagination. If you think about whatever it is, the holiest person you can think of, and all of a sudden they're moving away from Jesus, and they're starting to incorporate things that are not Jesus-like, right? Hatred and some of the different things of that nature. Then that movement away from them is negative, right? So center set is all about the movement towards, rather than are you on this target or not? Are you on this within this bound set or not? Right. Now, there's a third option, which is kind of cluster set. And the cluster set basically is, if I'm going back to the archery example, if I'm shooting an archery bow and arrow, and I'm always kind of clustering on, say, a group of target that's like maybe lower right-hand corner, and also I'm hitting that all the time, then it's all of a sudden you can say, oh, I'm good. Right. So, because that's just naturally where I'm hitting. Right. So in that sense, there's no boundary, but there's no center. It's just where you happen to be at. Just because you're repetitive, it makes it the repetitive nature of it. Therefore, you quote unquote good, so to speak, right? Consistency, which is also has some difficulties historically because different groups being the consistency, and if there's no center, then how are you trying to get there, right? I really do I think both of us in our talks, Jesus of Nazareth, who's the visible representation of the invisible God, the incarnation or the flesh dwelling of the Creator, is giving us a center to walk towards. Right. And so that center set is we want to walk towards Him, and that movement towards Him is all that matters. Right. Now, for me, that's given me a really broad view, because now it doesn't matter what name you're talking about or what you look like or what your actions are. If you're moving towards Jesus and you're starting to show the fruits of the Spirit that Paul talks about, and your heart is yearning for that, then I'm like, hey, great, you're walking in. Because it goes back to definitions again, because Christianity, broad term. We talked about Christianity, broad terms. But not all Christianity and not all doctrines are created equal. Correct. And not all practices are quite equal. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about on this podcast, is the implications of these doctrines. Right. So, again, I can't keep going down there because it's so important. Mental health, I think, is a big one. This is kind of a side note, but it kind of connects to it, is that growing up with a very bound set mentality, I was always asked as a child, how many people have I brought to Christ? How many people have I evangelized?
Right.
And if I didn't evangelize enough people, then I was seen as a failure.
Right.
And even at, in middle school and in high school, the youth pastors would be like, well, did you bring a friend today? How many of you told the people? And it's like, oh, I need the notches on my belt, per se. I need to have those people coming in.
Right.
And if you weren't doing it, then you were a bad Christian.
Right.
And those who are bringing their friends to youth group, or those who were telling the evangelism story,
right.
They were the good Christians. And that everything about Christianity was built upon, are you evangelizing people or bringing people to church, right?
Yeah. Which is really unfortunate, because if you look at the Great Commission, right? Like the Great Commission is saturated in evangelism, and I think kind of like with discipleship, evangelism also carries like this baggage weight for you,
right?
Which I know it does. I know, and it's understandable. That. We'll unpack that, and like as a mental health therapist, like that's true for a lot of my clients who come in with religious trauma, and for me, I would love to like give an understanding that like these words, just because they were used in ways that were harmful, doesn't mean that at their core they were ever meant to be harmful.
Correct.
Right? Because like Jesus was an evangelist. But he didn't harm people.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of it was just education and practicing and showing. It wasn't weaponized as this, be good by doing this thing, by bringing more people to our club.
Well, which is why for me the center set has been helpful, because now if I bump into somebody, I could talk about Jesus, and I could talk about helping them point them to Jesus. And I'm not concerned about having to have them pray a prayer.
Right.
Right. It's like, you have to pray the prayer of salvation. Now, the prayer of salvation is needed. I think we have to start somewhere.
Right.
But that isn't the goal.
Right.
The goal is to introduce them to Jesus. And then it said the Holy Spirit will actually draw the people to you.
Right. Right.
But
our job is obedience.
Right. Exactly. Right. And it's not our job is obedience doesn't mean you have to clinch the deal in sales terminology.
Right. Because we're not selling the Holy Spirit.
Right. We're just introducing. We're doing obedience is doing the things that Jesus said to do, and then being honest with what those are with our people around us.
Right.
Right. Which is a type of evangelism. But it's a different type that's not weaponized.
Right. And also, just to unpack that word a little bit, I know it's not exactly what we're talking about this episode, but slight rabbit trail is like, even evangelism means different things in different contexts, because you have like the gift of evangelism, which is just the gift of ability of like gathering people, like it talks about in Ephesians, the 5 different gifts of the Spirit. Right. And so like that type of like evangelism where God has naturally gifted you to evangelize just means like you're able to connect and to gather people. And I say that because like that's one of like my high giftings is connection. And so for the other evangelist gifted people, I don't want to say like, just because just because like you're gifted in this doesn't mean like you're demonized and automatically put into this group where people have used that word to hurt people.
Correct. And I think that goes back to a lot of what we're trying to do with the podcast is even unpack these views and again, the mental health views of what those are.
Right.
And that's where, for me, evangelism has been weaponized to the point that when I hear that terminology, especially from a church group or a gathering, there is kind of this pit in my stomach that comes up, and you're like, oh God,
here comes the blow.
Oh, I don't want this, right? Because it's been so weaponized and there's been so much stress around it. Again, great people who are trying to do good, and on that bound set mentality, their heart really is to try to help bring people to this understanding of Jesus, because they really love Jesus. But as somebody growing up and seeing that, I'm not naturally going out there and doing it, it became a very negative deal. Right. And so, but being able to focus on like, you know what? I don't have to clinch the deal. I don't have to have a prayer.
Right.
I can be able to just tell people about Jesus.
Right.
And I've had some amazing conversations with people, some phenomenal conversations with people of different backgrounds and beliefs, ethnicities, again, all across the deals, from Wiccan to Islam to Hindus to, all this kind of stuff, talking to people about Jesus and about the Creator, and I will use non-Christianese terms, because again, I'll use the word Creator. I will use the word maybe different pronouns for God. Oh no, this is getting a little bit crazy. But you start seeing things and people understanding that, and you're not having to go, well, he was washed in the blood. Well, what the heck does that mean? So again, we're kind of getting off the topic from Christianity,
right?
But I guess goes to show that I think we need to stop being afraid of using different terms and understanding that Christianity is big, it's broad. Not all doctrines are the same. Not all are equal. And I guess we kind of wrap it up here. I would say one of the goals that I have for this one, I don't know about you, Angel, one of my goals is to introduce people to different ways of seeing different doctrines and beliefs. And then they can then choose, hey, this one makes better sense for me at this time and place. Yeah. I don't have to leave Christianity because evangelism or whatever else became negative. I didn't leave the flock of Christianity. I still consider myself a Christian, right, in a very broad sense. But I have shifted from the fundamentalism and the bound mentality. And so I also do tend to look and say, if I'm going to believe a theological doctrine or belief or an action, is that going to bring more people to Jesus? And is it going to reflect the character of Jesus or is not?
Yeah. And I would caveat with that with saying how these doctrines or theologies fit with me based on how I'm being led by the Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit?
I know. That's another thing. We may or may not do.
Of you, I tell you.
Yes, I am one of those Christians that believes in the Holy Spirit communing with me and talking to me and guiding me. And so for me, it's not this like, oh, this theology resonates with me and how I believe, because then how are we moving towards Jesus if I'm doing it based on my own feelings? Like for me in my walk, I have to be led by how the Holy Spirit's talking to me, because that's how this started for me in my own walk from when I was 7 was with the Holy Spirit.
There we go, folks. I think next episode we might unpack the mystical voice of the Holy Spirit.
Ooh, what does he sound like? Oh. Does he sound like Morgan Freeman? So, she, in fact, was not being led to a Southern Baptist.
So stay tuned for the Holy Spirit episode coming up. Yeah. All right, guys. Well, thank you all. Angel, it's been great having a conversation with you about Christianity and defining that term.
Samesies.
Stay tuned for our 2 more weeks. We'll come out with Fractured Faith, a Mosaic of Belief, episode 3, as we continue to chat and unpack some of the stuff there. And thank you guys for tuning in. Tell your friends. Not in a bound set way. Right. This is not legalism. Not legalism. They could be wonderful followers and not listen to our podcast. There you go. All right. Take care, guys. Bye. Bye.